I had always been skeptical about the supernatural. As a clinical psychologist, I believed there was an explanation for every oddity, every unexplainable occurrence. But that was before I took the case of Emily Harper, a 16-year-old girl whose life spiraled into a waking nightmare after her family moved into 13 Ashwood Lane. Emily was a bright, articulate teenager when I met her. She and her family had relocated to this quiet suburban home just 6 months prior, hoping to start fresh after her father's job transfer. At first glance, the house was nothing unusual. 2 stories, red brick, a creaky porch swaying in the breeze. But the energy inside was suffocating. From the moment I walked in for my first consultation, I felt an inexplicable heaviness in my chest. Emily's mother, Corinne, greeted me with tired eyes and trembling hands. "Thank you for coming," she whispered, glancing nervously toward the staircase. "She's in her room." But she isn't herself anymore. When I entered Emily's room, the air grew colder. She sat in the corner, her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes fixed on the wall. She didn't acknowledge me at first. Her once vibrant blue eyes were clouded with an eerie gray hue. "Emily," I said softly, kneeling beside her. She turned her head slowly, her lips curling into a smile that sent chills down my spine. "He's here," she whispered, her voice a guttural rasp that didn't match her youthful appearance. "Who's here, Emily?" I asked, maintaining my composure. "The man in the shadows," she replied, her gaze darting to the darkened corner of the room. Corinne clutched her rosary tightly. "She's been like this for weeks," she said, her voice breaking. "It started with strange noises at night, whispers, footsteps. Then Emily began sleepwalking, and speaking in languages she's never learned." As a psychologist, I considered all possible explanations: sleep disorders, dissociative identity disorder, even hallucinations caused by stress. But nothing prepared me for what unfolded over the next few weeks. During our sessions, Emily's behavior grew more erratic. She began levitating objects, books, pencils, even her bed on one occasion. Her voice would shift between tones and accents, some guttural, others high-pitched. But the most disturbing moment came during our 3rd session when she recited, word for word, details of my life she couldn't possibly know. "Do you still miss your brother, Dr. Keller?" she sneered. "He's waiting for you, in the dark." I froze. My younger brother, Jacob, had died in a car accident 10 years ago. I had never spoken about him to anyone, let alone Emily. Corinne grew desperate. "We've tried everything," she sobbed. "Priests, exorcisms. Nothing works. It's like the house itself won't let her go." Out of options, I reached out to Father Gabriel, a seasoned exorcist who had dealt with cases of possession for over 3 decades. He was a stoic man with piercing green eyes that seemed to see through every facade. "This house is a portal," he said after stepping inside. "Something ancient and malevolent dwells here, and it has claimed Emily as its vessel." The night of the exorcism was the most harrowing experience of my life. Father Gabriel sat up in the living room, chanting prayers in Latin, while Corinne and I held hands, trembling with fear. Emily was restrained on the couch, her body convulsing violently, as the priest sprinkled holy water over her. The lights flickered, and an unnatural wind howled through the house. Emily's voice deepened, and she began speaking in a language I couldn't identify. The words seemed to reverberate through the room, each syllable filled with venom. "You cannot save her," the voice growled, emanating from Emily's lips. "She belongs to me." Father Gabriel didn't waver. He continued his prayers, his voice rising above the chaos. Emily screamed, her body arching unnaturally as black veins spread across her skin. The room grew darker, and the temperature dropped to an unbearable chill. Then, with a deafening shriek, Emily collapsed. The room fell silent. When she opened her eyes, they were clear again. She blinked, confused. "Mom," she whispered. Karen rushed to her daughter, tears streaming down her face. "You're safe now, baby," she sobbed, cradling Emily in her arms. But the house wasn't done with us. As we prepared to leave, the front door slammed shut on its own, and a sinister laugh echoed through the halls. "This isn't over," Father Gabriel warned, his expression grave. "The entity may have been expelled from Emily, but it still lingers in this house. You must leave and never return." The Harpers moved out the next day, leaving 13 Ashwood Lane abandoned. But I couldn't let go of what had happened. I found myself drawn back to the house one final time, determined to uncover the truth. When I stepped inside, the air was thick with malevolence. Whispers surrounded me, growing louder and more frantic. And then I saw it, a figure in the shadows, its eyes burning with an unholy light. I fled, my heart pounding in my chest. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. All I know is that 13 Ashwood Lane is a place where darkness thrives, a place where evil waits for its next victim. I first heard about the strange events at Cedar Lane Chapel through a frantic phone call from my childhood friend, Sarah. She was never the type to believe in ghost stories or superstitions, so her trembling voice immediately caught my attention. "It's Mark," she said, "her husband. He's not himself. Something happened to him in that chapel, and I think it's following him home." Sarah and Mark had recently bought an old property just outside town, a sprawling farmhouse with a weathered charm. At the back of their land, nestled behind a grove of ancient oak trees, was a decrepit chapel that hadn't been used in decades. Curious about their discovery, Mark had ventured inside one stormy afternoon. That, Sarah claimed, was when everything changed. I drove to the farmhouse that same evening, the road stretching endlessly under a sky weighed down with dark, ominous clouds. The house was lit faintly from within, and Sarah met me at the door, her face pale and gaunt. "Thank God you're here," she whispered, pulling me inside. Mark sat in the living room, staring blankly at the fireplace. He didn't react when I greeted him, his eyes vacant and his expression unnervingly still. "He's been like this for days," Sarah explained. "It's like he's not even there." I leaned closer to Mark. "What happened in the chapel, Mark?" I asked gently. For a moment, he didn't move. Then, his lips twitched, forming words that chilled me to the core. "I heard them," he murmured. "They're waiting." Sarah's grip on my arm tightened. "What does he mean?" she whispered, her voice cracking. Over the next few hours, Sarah filled me in on the details. After Mark had returned from the chapel, he complained of hearing whispers at night, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere. Objects in the house started moving on their own, and shadowy figures appeared in the corners of their vision. But the most terrifying moment came 3 nights ago when Sarah woke to find Mark standing at the foot of their bed, his eyes rolled back and his mouth moving silently. "It's like something is controlling him," she said, tears streaming down her face. "I don't know what to do." I stayed the night, determined to uncover the truth. As Sarah showed me to the guest room, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The air was thick with unease, and the house seemed to creak and groan as if alive. Around midnight, I was jolted awake by a loud crash. I rushed downstairs to find Mark standing in the kitchen, his hands covered in blood. A shattered mirror lay at his feet, and shards of glass sparkled like jagged teeth. "Mark," I called out, but he didn't respond. Instead, he began to laugh, a deep, guttural sound that didn't belong to him. "They're coming," he said, his voice distorted. "The chapel called them." Sarah appeared, her face frozen in terror. "We need help," she said. "We need to go back to the chapel." Against my better judgment, we decided to confront whatever presence lingered in the old building. Armed with flashlights and a Bible Sarah had found in the attic, we made our way through the woods, the towering trees casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. The chapel loomed ahead, its weathered walls covered in ivy and its broken windows resembling empty eyes. As we stepped inside, the air grew colder, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over us. Mark stood motionless in the center of the chapel, surrounded by an array of symbols carved into the floor. The symbols glowed faintly, pulsing with a sinister energy. "Mark!" Sarah cried, but he didn't move. The whispers began, growing louder and more insistent. Shadows danced along the walls, and an oppressive darkness filled the room. "Leave," a voice boomed, shaking the very foundation of the chapel. I held tightly to Sarah's hand, my heart pounding in my chest. "Mark, you need to fight this," I shouted. Mark's body convulsed, and he fell to his knees. His eyes glowed unnaturally, and his mouth moved as if speaking in an ancient language. Sarah clutched the Bible and began reciting prayers, her voice trembling but resolute. The air crackled with energy, and the shadows recoiled as if in pain. With a final, deafening scream, the darkness erupted from Mark's body, dissipating into the night. He collapsed, and the glowing symbols faded into nothingness. We carried him back to the farmhouse, shaken but relieved that the ordeal seemed to be over. In the days that followed, Mark regained his strength, though he had no memory of what had happened. The chapel was demolished, its cursed remnants buried deep beneath the earth. But every now and then, Sarah swears she hears faint whispers in the wind, a reminder that some things are better left undisturbed. Meadow Hill was a quiet neighborhood where life moved at a peaceful pace. Families thrived, and children played on the neatly trimmed lawns. But all of that changed when the old Langford house became occupied again. The Langford house was a relic from another time, standing at the edge of the neighborhood with its ivy-covered walls and decaying shutters. For years, it had been the subject of whispered stories about its eerie past and the tragedies that plagued its previous owners. When Peter and Emily Carmichael moved into the house, the community was abuzz. They were a young couple, eager to start their lives in a place they could call home. Peter worked in real estate, and Emily was an artist, drawn to the house's unique character, as she put it. At first, the couple seemed happy, excited even. They hosted a small housewarming party, inviting the neighbors to ease their arrival into the community. I was among those who attended. The inside of the house was as strange as its exterior, with narrow hallways and oddly angled rooms. Emily seemed thrilled by the house's quirks, but Peter wore an expression I couldn't quite place, something between apprehension and unease. 2 weeks later, Emily called me. We had bonded briefly over shared interests at the party, and she remembered I was a counselor. She sounded desperate. "It's Peter," she whispered, her voice shaking. "He's different. I don't know how to explain it, but something is wrong with him. I need your help." I agreed to visit that evening, curious and a bit concerned. When I arrived, Emily met me at the door, her face pale and drawn. She led me to the living room, where Peter sat in a chair, staring blankly at the television. The screen was black. "Peter," I said gently, sitting across from him. He didn't respond at first, but then he turned to look at me. His eyes were glassy, unfocused. When he spoke, his voice was low and unfamiliar. "It's here," he said. A chill ran down my spine. "What's here, Peter?" I asked. He didn't answer, his gaze drifting back to the blank television. Emily pulled me aside, her hands trembling. "He's been like this since the night he went into the basement," she said. "He claimed he heard voices coming from below, but when I checked, there was nothing there. After that, he changed. The basement." The word alone sent a shiver through me. The Langford house's basement was part of the stories, rumored to be where the previous owner had practiced something dark and unnatural. "Have you been down there since?" I asked. Emily shook her head. "I'm too afraid." "I thought maybe you could ... double quotes." Her voice trailed off, but I understood her implication. That night, after Peter had fallen into a restless sleep, Emily and I decided to investigate the basement. Armed with flashlights and a sense of dread, we descended the creaking stairs. I nodded, reaching out to open it. The chest groaned as it gave way, revealing a collection of old, yellowed books, candles, and what appeared to be ritualistic artifacts. Suddenly, the basement seemed to hum with energy. The temperature dropped further, and the light from our flashlights flickered. "Get out!" a guttural voice growled, echoing through the space. We froze, our breath visible in the icy air. "Who's there?" I called, my voice trembling. The chest slammed shut on its own, and the humming grew louder, more oppressive. Emily grabbed my arm. "We need to leave," she said, panic in her voice. We bolted up the stairs, slamming the basement door behind us. But as we turned to face the living room, we saw Peter standing there, his expression blank, his eyes dark. "Did you find it?" he asked in that same low, unfamiliar voice. Emily started crying, backing away. "What's happening to him?" she whispered. Over the next few days, things escalated. Peter's behavior became more erratic. He would disappear for hours, only to be found in the basement, muttering in a language neither Emily nor I could understand. Objects in the house moved on their own, and strange symbols began appearing on the walls, as if drawn by an unseen hand. Desperate, Emily reached out to a local historian who specialized in the occult. His name was Richard Greaves, and he agreed to come to the house. Richard arrived armed with knowledge and tools, salt, candles, and books on rituals and protections. He confirmed what we had feared. "Something was summoned here long ago," he said, "and it never left." Peter was now completely unresponsive, confined to the basement. Richard insisted we conduct a cleansing ritual, but warned us it would not be easy. That night, we gathered in the basement, lighting candles and forming a protective circle around Peter, who sat slumped against the wall. Richard began chanting, his voice steady despite the oppressive atmosphere. The room seemed to come alive. Shadows writhed on the walls, and the symbols etched into the chest glowed faintly. Peter began to convulse, his body writhing as an unearthly scream tore from his throat. "Hold the circle," Richard shouted. Emily clung to me, tears streaming down her face as the ritual reached its climax. Peter's body arched, and for a moment, It felt as if the entire house might collapse. Then, with a deafening roar, a dark, amorphous figure erupted from Peter's body, disappearing into the void. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy dissipating like a receding storm. Peter collapsed, unconscious but alive. In the days that followed, the house seemed lighter, as if a weight had been lifted. Peter had no memory of his possession, but he and Emily decided to sell the Langford house and leave Meadowhill for good. As for me, I'll never forget the darkness we faced in that basement, or the terrifying knowledge that some places truly are cursed. I was called to investigate a case in Maple Hollow, a small, unassuming town nestled between dense forests and rolling hills. My name is Lucas Taylor, and I am a paranormal researcher. Over the years, I had built a reputation for exploring phenomena that others couldn't explain. Yet, when I received a desperate email from a family claiming their youngest daughter had been possessed, I hesitated. Possession cases were rare, even among the most hardened believers in the supernatural. But their urgency, coupled with the chilling video they attached, compelled me to respond. The video showed 9-year-old Leela Harrison, her voice guttural and her eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, reciting what sounded like ancient Latin. I arrived at the Harrison home late in the afternoon, the sun dipping low over the forested horizon. The house stood isolated, its weathered exterior giving off an air of unease. The family, Mark, Rachel, and their 3 children, were visibly exhausted, their faces pale and drawn. "Thank you for coming," Rachel said, wringing her hands as she led me inside. Their home was a maze of religious artifacts. Crucifixes hung on nearly every wall, and the faint scent of incense lingered in the air. "She's upstairs," Mark said, his voice heavy with worrying. "We've kept her locked in her room for her safety, and ours." He hesitated before adding, "But she's not our Leela anymore." The atmosphere grew heavier as we climbed the stairs. When Mark unlocked the door to Leela's room, I was hit with a wave of cold air. The girl sat cross-legged on the bed, her eyes fixed on me. Her presence filled the room with an unnatural energy, and the air seemed to hum with tension. "Lucas Taylor," she said, her voice layered with something inhuman. "Do you think you can help them?" I swallowed hard, my instincts screaming at me to leave. "But I'd come here for a reason. Leela, can you hear me?" I asked, ignoring the entity's taunt. Her head tilted unnaturally, her mouth curling into a twisted smile. "She's gone, only I remain." Rachel let out a soft sob, clutching Mark's arm. That night, I began my investigation, setting up cameras, audio recorders, and EMF detectors throughout the house. Mark shared the history of their property, mentioning the discovery of an old, hidden room in the basement during renovations. They'd left it undisturbed, but shortly after, strange occurrences began. Lights flickered, objects moved on their own, and Leela's behavior changed. She became withdrawn, often staring at corners of the house where no one stood. When I ventured into the basement, I found the hidden room they described. It was small and circular, its stone walls etched with runes and symbols I didn't recognize. At the center of the room was an altar, blackened by what looked like ancient burn marks. "Something was summoned here," I muttered to myself, feeling a chill run down my spine. As I examined the space, my EMF detector spiked wildly, and my recorder picked up faint whispers in a language I couldn't identify. Returning upstairs, I reviewed the footage from my cameras. In Leela's room, a shadowy figure appeared briefly behind her before vanishing. The audio picked up guttural growls and an ominous chant, ex tenebris oremur. Out of the darkness, we rise. I contacted my colleague, Dr. Evelyn Cross, a linguist and occult specialist. When she arrived the next morning, she examined the recordings and symbols. "This is serious," she said, her expression grim. "The language is a dialect of Latin used in ancient rituals to summon entities. The room in the basement isn't just a sanctum. It's a gateway. A gateway to what?" I asked. Evelyn hesitated. "Something old. Something powerful." We decided to conduct a cleansing ritual that evening. Evelyn prepared the necessary items: salt, holy water, and candles, while I briefed the Harrisons on what to expect. As night fell, the house seemed to awaken. Shadows moved where there shouldn't be any, and whispers echoed in the halls. In Leela's room, Evelyn and I drew a protective circle around the girl. Mark and Rachel stood just outside, clutching rosaries. Evelyn began the ritual, chanting in a firm, steady voice. The room grew colder, and the candles flickered violently. Leela screamed, her body convulsing. Her voice shifted between her own and something guttural, ancient. "You can't stop me," the entity growled. "She belongs to us." Evelyn didn't falter, her chants growing louder. The shadows in the room coalesced into a single, towering figure, its eyes burning like embers. The entity lunged at Evelyn, but the protective circle held. It roared in frustration, the sound shaking the walls. I joined Evelyn in the chant, holding up a crucifix. The entity shrieked, its form writhing and contorting. "Release her," I commanded. With one final piercing scream, the entity was sucked back into the ether, leaving the room eerily silent. Leela collapsed, her small body trembling. Rachel rushed to her, cradling her daughter in her arms. "Is it over?" Mark asked, his voice shaking. Evelyn nodded, though her expression remained troubled. "The gateway in the basement is closed, but the energy it released has left a mark on this house. You should leave." The Harrisons didn't need convincing. They packed their belongings and moved out the next day. As for me, I left Maple Hollow with a deeper respect for the forces that lurk in the shadows. The Langford house was eventually abandoned, its dark history forgotten by most. But I know that the shadows still linger, waiting for the day when someone is foolish enough to awaken them again. Alex Carter was the kind of man who lit up every room he entered. A high school history teacher with a passion for storytelling, he captivated both his students and colleagues with tales of the past, weaving historical events into engaging narratives. Married to his college sweetheart, Mia, and father to an energetic 7-year-old named Ben, Alex's life seemed picture-perfect. But that was before the Carter family moved into their dream house in rural Vermont, a sprawling colonial-era property with acres of untamed woods surrounding it. The first few months in the house were idyllic. Alex spent his weekends renovating, Mia cultivated a garden, and Ben roamed the woods, fascinated by the wildlife. However, their peace shattered one stormy evening in October. Mia woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of Alex murmuring in his sleep. At first, she dismissed it as the product of a vivid dream. But when she leaned closer, she realized he was speaking in a language she didn't recognize. His voice was deep and guttural, his words flowing with unnerving precision. "Alex," she whispered, gently shaking him. His eyes snapped open, and for a brief moment, they glowed faintly in the darkness. Mia stumbled backward, gasping. "Are you okay?" she asked, her voice trembling. Alex sat up, his expression blank. "I don't remember." The next morning, he dismissed the incident as stress from work, but the occurrences didn't stop. Alex began waking up at odd hours, often found pacing the house or standing motionless by the windows. He grew irritable and distant, snapping at Mia and Ben over trivial matters. Mia sought help from a local priest, Father Callahan, who agreed to visit the house. As soon as he stepped inside, his demeanor changed. "This house has a heavy presence," he said, his voice low. "Tell me everything." Mia explained the changes in Alex's behavior and the strange occurrences in the house, doors opening on their own, shadows moving in her peripheral vision, and the inexplicable cold that seemed to emanate from the basement. Father Callahan agreed to bless the house. As he walked through the rooms, sprinkling holy water and reciting prayers, Alex watched him with unnerving intensity. "You think that will help?" Alex asked, his voice laced with mockery. Father Callahan paused, turning to face him. "It's not you speaking, is it?" Alex smirked. Perhaps. The blessing seemed to provoke whatever was inside Alex. That night, Mia woke up to find him missing. Panicked, she searched the house, eventually finding him in the basement. He was crouched in a corner, scratching symbols into the dirt floor with his fingernails. His eyes glowed faintly, and his lips moved in a silent chant. "Alex," Mia screamed. He turned to her, his face contorted in rage. "Leave!" he roared, his voice echoing unnaturally. Terrified, Mia grabbed Ben and drove to her sister's house. The next morning, she returned with Father Callahan and two of his colleagues, both experienced in dealing with possessions. The team began an exorcism, restraining Alex in a chair in the living room. Mia watched from the corner, clutching Ben tightly. As the priests recited their prayers, Alex thrashed against his restraints, his voice alternating between his own and something guttural and alien. "You have no power here," the entity bellowed. Father Callahan stood firm. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this man." The room grew colder, and a foul stench filled the air. The lights flickered, and the shadows on the walls seemed to take on a life of their own, writhing and twisting. Alex let out a blood-curdling scream, his body convulsing violently. The entity fought back, hurling objects across the room and causing the walls to shake. "Why him?" Father Callahan demanded. "He called me," the entity snarled. "In his dreams, he summoned me." Mia's heart sank as she remembered Alex's fascination with the house's history. He had mentioned finding old journals in the attic, written by the house's original owner, a man accused of practicing dark rituals. The exorcism continued for hours, the priests unwavering in their prayers. Finally, with one last, agonized scream, the entity was expelled, leaving Alex slumped in the chair, unconscious. When he woke, Alex had no memory of the possession, but the toll it had taken on his body and spirit was evident. The Carters sold the house and moved back to the city, vowing never to speak of their ordeal again. But sometimes, in the dead of night, Alex still hears whispers, and in his dreams, he sees the symbols he etched into the basement floor, glowing faintly in the darkness.